Welcome, listeners, to a brand new bonus episode of Oh My Word podcast. And today, as we've done a few times before, we are going to go behind the scenes of one of my books. This one specifically, Lies of Golden Straw, which is the second installation in the End of Ever After series. And it's also recently been turned into an audiobook. So you can own the entire set. You can have read-alongs, sing-alongs, and all kinds of fun. We're going to go behind the scenes now a little bit of how and why the story was written the way it was. Just a heads up, there will be spoilers ahead. Let's get started. Lies of Golden Straw is a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. For all these books, there's 5 altogether in the series, and for each of them, I wanted to make sure that these fairy tale retellings were going to have the original story in them. So instead of taking the story and then sort of adapting it to a brand new story where you just sort of see certain plot points play out or bring it into the modern world or something like that, I stuck to the original world of the story in the sense that theoretically, if you remove all the parts that I added, you basically find an intact Rumpelstiltskin still within the story that's told. One of the things also with these stories that I'm sort of calling them, this was actually my editor who described them like this, that they're memoir-style, that the protagonist who's writing it, whether it's one of the princesses, queens, or if it's one of the princes, they're writing it kind of looking back over this fairy tale, taking advantage of the fact that you already know the fairy tale. Like you already know Rumpelstiltskin, and now I'm going to fill in the blanks sort of. I'm going to expand the part of the story that's not always told, because then it would just be a really long story that you can't just tell around the campfire. Another thing that I was sort of calling these like anti-fairy tale stories or retellings, because there's no big romance moments in the way that you have them in traditional fairy tales. And by traditional, I should probably highlight that it's more kind of like the Disney versions that kind of made the firework moments happen. There's no firework moment like that. A lot of these characters are a little bit more deceiving and a little bit more dishonest, a little bit more, because we're looking past and not everything as rosy and beautiful as we think, or as we've been led to believe by those who have told over the tale. So that's why I sort of gave them this description of calling them anti-fairy tale. So how does that fit into the story of Rumpelstiltskin? The regular story of Rumpelstiltskin is you have a miller who brags about how his daughter could spin straw into gold. The king hears about it. He brings her into the palace and puts her in a room with a spindle and the straw, spin it into gold. She has no idea how that's going to happen. She's crying. A little man appears to her, says, "Why are you crying?" She's like, "I got to spin this into gold." "Well, for payment, I'll do that." So first she gives the ring, she gives a necklace, and then finally she promises her firstborn child with the king. She doesn't think that's actually going to be a thing, but then the king does marry her afterward, after the third time that she could spin the straw into gold, which is actually, the little man. And then obviously when she has the child, the little man comes back and says, "I want payment. You promised me the baby." And she says, "No, you don't get him. Okay, new deal. If you could guess my name, I think it's 3 days to guess the name, then you can have the baby." And also she goes through every single name she could possibly think of, and she doesn't get the name right. She scours the kingdom. One of the servants is out, and who knows where, out of the forest, and he comes across a little clearing. There's a little man there. He's built a bonfire. He hops around the bonfire, and he's singing about how he's going to take the queen's baby because she's never going to know that his name is Rumpelstiltskin. So he gives away his name. The servant takes that name back to the queen, comes again. She says, "Is your name this, that, whatever? Is it Rumpelstiltskin?" And he just implodes and he is gone. So this story now is the framework of the Lies of Golden Straw retelling. It's the underlying plot points, but it's not enough now to be a novel. We have to expand the story. Part of how the story is expanded is not just to add in more scenes and more characters and things like that, but also to focus on certain themes that are going to be occurring and reoccurring throughout the story. For example, Lies of Golden Straw focuses on 2 themes that are actually part of the original Rumpelstiltskin telling. So a lot of times people interpret the original story as a story about greed, that the king, make more gold and things like that. But so we sort of touch upon that in the novel, but the main themes that are focused on in this novel is a theme of names, trying to find the name. And also what's specifically interesting about the Rumpelstiltskin story is that if you go back to that fairy tale, the miller's daughter is never given a name, right? It's not like Cinderella or Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, that even if they have their names or they have what they're referred to as, but the miller's daughter is not more than the miller's daughter. So that was actually an interesting thing to focus on. And this idea of what is a name. Rumpelstiltskin is destroyed by knowing his name, in a sense of knowing the essence of who he is, focusing on that aspect of him that ends up destroying him. But at the same time, we see that the miller's daughter doesn't have a name, but our protagonist could not have a name, but it was an interesting thing to start off with someone who actually doesn't have a name. So what does that mean for the story? We named her Millie, okay, Miller's daughter, Millie, but she tells us from the outset her mother passes away in childbirth before she could actually give her name. So she was never named, and then she grew up with her father, who's a little interesting character in his own right. She grew up with her father, who the father didn't never named her because it's only the two of them in the house. He didn't feel like he had to give her a name. He could just say, daughter, come here, or you get over here, or whatever. He never felt like he had to give her a name, which obviously says something about the dad. If we think about it further, we know that a name it's how we identify ourselves to people. It's how we identify people to differentiate them from each other. But also the name holds kind of part of their character and their personality is in that name. When I say, oh, remember this person, it's not just a name that comes up and an image that comes up. There are pieces of them that are recalled in that name as well. So one of the things that we see, Millie first gets her name when she goes to school because that's when she's around other kids. So she's about first grader-ish, around that kind of age. Teacher's going around saying, what's your name? What's your name? And all of a sudden she realizes I don't actually have a name. Daughter is not actually my name. Daughter is just my relationship to my father, and that's just what he called me. So she freezes, what's her name? And who gives her a name is Merlin, which is kind of who becomes her best friend, Merlin. Merlin is what we call in this universe magical, as in he can perform magic. Some people were like, oh, don't bring in Arthurian legends into this. Why are you naming Merlin? But I don't know, just the name seemed to fit for me. Part of what happens at that moment that Merlin says, oh, her name's Millie. And the teacher's like, oh, your name's Millie? So she says, yeah, okay, like that'll do. Move on to the next person. Part of what occurs here, or at least subconsciously what occurs, is that she now wants to become the Millie that Merlin just named. So originally she's only daughter and her whole life revolved around her relationship with her father. Now that her world is growing and she's making new friends and she's meeting new people, she's now seeing Merlin, whoever this kid is, he gives her a name, Millie. Oh, I'm going to live up to the image of Millie that he has. It's almost like I guess you could call it like a self-fulfilling prophecy or something like that. Like, oh, he's going to name me Millie. He wants me to be Millie. So whatever Millie means to him, that's who I'm going to be. She mentions at one point, our Millie character mentions at one point that about her mother never gave her name. Maybe she wanted to tell me that I could be anyone, right? Don't limit yourself. Be whoever you want to be. But in the end, she realizes, looking at her own choices in her own life, because I could be anyone, I was a no one. Not in the sense of insignificance, but in the sense of I had no shape to give myself, right? There was no shape for me to mold and work with. It was almost like there were too many choices. So not because I couldn't change or be anybody, because we do see, especially in the different tellings of in the Ever After series, Millie in a lot of ways the one who takes the most initiative to shape herself. But she does that in her action to the way other people see her, which is actually pretty different from Azar in The Beauty and the Beast. He sort of has the self-fulfilling prophecy, but in the negative. Like, oh, people see me as this angry, temperamental person. Like, yes, I am an angry, temperamental person. Millie sees it more of like, oh, this is who you want me to be? Okay, I'm going to be that person. I'm going to see if I like it. Until finally she comes to the point when she does end up marrying the king and he says, oh, what's your full name? Like, what's your actual name? So she thinks about it for a moment. She said, oh, my name's Emmeline. She all of a sudden is now giving herself a new persona to become because she realizes at that moment, I can be anyone. I'm going to be this person. I'm going to be this Emmeline. Emmeline is the woman married to the king. She's now a queen. I am now going to become that person. So on the one hand, it's kind of a good thing, the fact that she's kind of taking control of who she wants to be and the way she wants to shape herself. But there is kind of a negative aspect to it because there is a sense of, I'm just going to say dishonesty for lack of a better word. There's a sense of, okay, I'm going to fulfill the image that you see or this image that we're going to create. I'm going to mold myself to that instead of her just being herself kind of. She becomes the selves that she creates. It's kind of an interesting dynamic that she has. And then also in the thing of the name, that also we do come to the point where Rumpelstiltskin helps her 3 times and she does have to guess his name to save her son, to save her child. And the guessing of the name does destroy him as it does in the original. And then we also have a little bit, I just kind of threw it in there because she does have a son and the son has to have a name too. So the king kind of promised her, oh, you can name our son as long as it's, you choose any of these royal names, like I'll let you choose the name. And she doesn't immediately name him because she's hesitant. She doesn't know what's going to happen with the Rumpelstiltskin character. Like, will I actually be able to defeat him? I don't want to name him and then he's going to be taken away from me and the pain is going to be so much greater. But there is also the sense of the importance of the moment, what you realize is that I could give him a name. That's the first framework and shape and structure to his character that I give him is giving him the name. This name, especially naming after one of the royals that came before him, how am I kind of directing him? What kind of guidance am I giving him through whichever name I choose for him? That's kind of a theme that goes along. And that's why she's changing her name so many times and all these things like that is because that's That's what's really going on with her as a character. That's kind of the arc that she's going through, which is also why the moment that she does change her name is also the moment that she breaks with Merlin. They never really speak about where I was going to be in each other's future, but she kind of has the moment where she realizes that perhaps it was always understood, but that doesn't mean I have to go along with it, right? So she does take control of her life. She chooses to be a queen over sticking around with Merlin, that she chooses, I'm not going to be his Millie anymore. I'm now going to be a person that I'm going to create. And that's where Emmeline comes in. By the time she makes it back to the palace, she now has a new name, a new persona that she becomes. Which, going back to the whole anti-fairy tale sort of thing, her whole relationship with the king is kind of based, maybe it's not exactly a lie, but it is an untruth. She doesn't tell him the truth about who she is and who she was before. I mean, even just being Miller's daughter carries a certain identity with it and a certain image of character that kind of comes with it. But she never says more than that. She doesn't say, oh, I used to be this person, that person, that person. She pretends like this is who she was the whole time. So there is a kind of a streak of untruth in that relationship. Also with their relationship in general, it's never, they kind of develop a mutual respect for each other. And I guess there is care and perhaps some adoration, but I wouldn't say that they're ever like deeply in love with each other, because that would be agreeing that such a basic untruth, right? It's not an omission of truth. It's such a basic untruth can be woven into a foundation of relationship. How does that affect what that relationship is when she's allowing this untruth to be there? The other untruth she allows to be there is that she never admits to not being able to spin straw into gold. The king kind of guesses that she's not the one behind it, but there's never really any proof otherwise, and there's never an answer given for otherwise, so there's not really anything he could do with it. The Rain character sort of has this like obsession. From all the kingdoms, his in general has the most respect for magic, and raises magic up the most. He has a school for magicals. He wants to develop it. He keeps them in his court. Versus some of the other kingdoms that either have a distrust for it or kind of just let's all live and let live. He actually embraces it and wants to celebrate it. That's why he can't resist when he hears about a girl spinning straw into gold. And she comes and he knows right away that she's not magical. She doesn't have magic to her, and yet she's still making the straw into gold situation happen. She never admits to it and she never explains it. So the relationship started on this lie that she never corrected. She's not so bothered by it because she's happy with the new person that she's becoming, this queen and the wife to the king and all that. Another thing that we have, which is really a fundamental theme to the story, because it's also a fundamental idea to the Rumpelstiltskin's tale, is the power of words. And a little bit, as we mentioned, truth versus lies. Because everything began with her father's lies. And the way she begins her telling is that everyone knew my father was a liar, basically except for the king. So her father is this really interesting character in that he's always telling stories about the supposed life that he's led, even though he's a simple miller, everyone can see that. He's always telling stories and he always embellishes stories. He's always full of tall tales. Could they have been true? Well, theoretically, yes. Are they true? Probably not. Are they based in truth? Possibly. We don't ever really know. And Millie says she recognizes there's no way my father could have lived this life. There's no way that all these things could be true. And yet I don't really know what truth is because he never gives a straight answer for any of these things. She only ever sees real moments of truth from her father. And for example, when he holds his grandson for the first time, she sees the way he looks at the baby and sort of the pride and the love that he has. She's like, I know that that's a moment of truth. But outside of that, all the talking that he does, he just throws around words carelessly, and he's basically lucky that the king didn't come after him for this lie that he spread, and that Millie had this Rumpelstiltskin character to save her and turn the straw into gold. The other thing that we see is as the story is being told, my editor sort of warned me that not everyone would necessarily be able to notice that this happens. As the story is being told, and Millie talks about how, oh, my father's always making up stories, she comes to a point, especially being in the palace, and people start asking her, who are you, where are you from, and things like that. We notice that she starts taking stories and playing around with them and making them up too. And she has a moment where she realizes, hey, I'm turning into my father. But, in the sense that I'm spinning tales and all that kind of stuff. The end of this, which here's some of the spoilers of this, the end of this is twofold. One, this is kind of a little bit of an obvious that she has two sons, Jacob and Willem, which are the Grimm brothers. She kind of calls them that, and she talks about how, let them record the stories across the realm sort of thing. So that kind of slid in there. I figured it fit well with Millie, who's always telling stories and always spinning tales, for her to have kids who would document the stories that are always being spun. The other thing is, at the end, she says, I sat down to tell my sons the story. And as I spoke, I saw it coming alive before my eyes. I spun it before their eyes the way that I spun it before mine. I spun it to life with words that glittered like threads of golden straw. She kind of comes back around to the beginning of the story with that. And in that moment, what I sort of intended very subtly was to have this moment of saying, wait a second, Are you just spinning the story now? How do we know how much of the story you just relayed is actually true? So Millie is sort of an unreliable narrator. The only things that we know are actually fully true is we know that we have this Rumpelstiltskin fairy tale that somehow, quote unquote, has preserved through time. And in other books, she appears, because these are companion novels, she appears in other books. So we know that any of those scenes are real because we trust the other narrators. But Millie multiple times has warned us that she's taking on her father's habits of lying and spinning tales and tweaking the truth. And we see she does that. We see she does it in some of those personal aspects of her life, that she rejects Merlin, who represents, in a way or in certain ways, the truth and simplicity and where she came from. And she instead embraces the court life and the king and being and marriage with the king and becoming the queen and stuff like that, because I can make myself into anyone I want, which is true. But what does she risk? And what does she give up? Millie's choice, she was going to have to give something up, and she chose to give up Merlin, which is a side thing. We sort of say Merlin after that, after he helps her in the end defeat Rumpelstiltskin, he says, I can't stick around her anymore. I'm not going to be in this relationship that has all these lies that are now attached to it. I'm going to go off and find truth. But if we know King Arthur's court was not exactly, they had high ideals, but we know that there were some not great things going on in that court as well. Going back to this thing about words and truth and lies, that's sort of what it all comes to, is how much of Millie's story can we actually trust to be true? Theoretically, if we would live in her kingdom, there are certain things we could validate, but there are certain things that we can't. We can only believe what she tells us. She sort of hints at that in the way that she ends off her quote-unquote memoir. She also has a moment where after she becomes queen, she's running through the streets and she gets stopped by a guy who's holding a spindle. And he says, oh, I want you to bless it. You're so full of blessing. Bless it, bless it, bless it. So they turn this into this whole ritual where the queen now can bless anyone's spindle, and it's going to be so much blessing on everybody. It's like, what are you doing? That this story isn't true. You're not a magical that made all these things happen. It's like, well, the kingdom wants to believe it. We want to give them hope and whatever, we'll let them believe it. But she realizes that in that moment where she kind of realizes the figurehead that she's become, she realizes the image that people have of her throughout the wider kingdom and not just between her and, her little close circle there. She has conflicting emotions then. Emotions of shame and awe. Shame that, wow, I'm throwing words out there and they're actually becoming reality, and awe at what words can actually do. She even says that her awe comes from this wonder of what a few words had wrought and what a world had arisen from the power of such a careless few. So part of this whole word thing also is that, especially as a writer, it just shows, with a few words, we can actually build worlds. We can do a lot of positive and growth and building. And with words, we can also tear things down, or we could sow the seeds of lies and things like that. Not to go into so much detail of it, but it's something that we can each think about is what the power that words have and how we can use to build and not for other. For Millie specifically, she realizes this power of world building with words. She realizes the power it can hold over others, right? She can hold someone in thrall with the words that she's spinning by being a storyteller, the way it could capture people's attentions. She ends up giving into that power and that sense of look, I got all eyes on me. In speaking, in saying stories, I'm going to keep doing it. That's the choice that she makes. That's why also there's a few different fairy tales, smaller fairy tales and fables that are woven into the story. You have the Elves and the Shoemaker and kind of her twisted version on that. There are a few others that are brought in also, but one of them that really fit in very well, that aligned with these themes of words and truth and lies, was The Emperor's New Clothes. That's the story. The emperor was very vain, and then finally these two tailors think they're going to teach him a lesson, so they pretend like there's a material it's such a rare material that only those who are truly worthy can see it. Really, there's nothing there at all, but no one wants to admit that they can't see it. So okay, we're going to make you a beautiful outfit from this material. Basically, the emperor goes out, makes a big grand parade wearing his new suit, and he's not wearing clothes at all because it doesn't exist. The way it's brought into this Lies of a Golden Straw story is Rain, who's the king, talks about how his father was a really vain person who spent a lot of money on clothes, on exteriors and things like that. And he went parading around with his no clothes until someone called him out to say, hey, you're not wearing any clothes. And it was a little child. That little child was him. But he says it in the way that my father was almost doing it as a dare to see if anyone would actually tell him the truth about the fact that he wasn't wearing clothes. The father almost did it in a way of realizing, because of the power he held over his court and because of his position, that people were just telling him things that he wanted to hear. He actually wanted to challenge that face on and see what would happen. And what happened was that no one actually told him the truth. So he sort of did it, but he was sort of playing the game. It's kind of the way that the story is brought in there, but it's still something that fit very much into this idea of truth and lies and things like that. All right, and that's it. Those are a few basic points about Lies of Golden Straw. Some things, if you haven't read the book yet, still encourage you, paperback, ebook, audiobook, always for you to be able to read and experience this story. Now that you have these things, maybe be able to see how they came into play. If you have read the book already, maybe that will help shed some light or show some depth about some of the parts of the story. Or maybe you'll want to read the story again. And talk about it with friends. Tell them all about it. Let everyone read it together and see what else you can find in there. Thanks so much for joining me, and thanks so much for listening in on this bonus episode of Oh My Word Podcast. To find out more, either about Lies of Golden Straw or any of the other books I've got out, please look at the link in the episode notes and follow Oh My Word Podcast on Instagram or also through the website. You'll see all the stuff that we're up to through the podcast, the books that we're reading, and you'll be able to find more bonus episodes there. Subscribe, like, leave a starry star review. Catch you next time.